How They Find Out by Lilac Sky 128. Chapter 5. Leon. Leon was not happy at all. It was raining, it was muddy, and he still had to make the long journey back to Camelot on foot, because his horse had very unhelpfully bolted, something he couldn't quite understand because it had never been rebellious or unreliable in the past, which was more than he could say for his fellow knights. It wasn't that he precisely minded that he'd had to talk to the old woman alone, who was, as suspected, as mad as a hatter, but harmless enough. But it was a little irritating that all the knights who had supposedly volunteered for this had bailed. Yes, Elgin had a good enough reason for not being able to come, but Leon couldn't imagine where Gawain and Merlin had gotten to. They had come with him, but they seemed to have slipped out of the woman's house whilst he was still doing his "I am a knight of Camelot" spiel. If it had just been Gawain, he would have headed straight away to the nearest alehouse, but somehow he couldn't imagine Merlin shirking responsibility quite like that. He might not be a knight, but he was certainly more reliable than most. He still checked the alehouse, though. When this yielded no results, apart from getting slightly drunk, which at least made him a little happier, he hesitated before heading through the forest they'd come through. He was feeling slightly disgruntled, but he still kept an eye out for the two of them. The old woman had said that they appeared to have just walked out, so he reasoned they couldn't really be in danger, but a feeling of unease was settling in his stomach, not to mention that he could just imagine Arthur's reaction if he returned on his own. When Arthur had first mentioned this outing, most of the knights had thought it stupid, but Leon had thought that there would be no harm in checking it out, given that it might spread panic amongst the residents of Camelot if it got out. Arthur also seemed slightly irritated, but he insisted on it being followed up. An old woman in a town close to Camelot's borders had claimed that she had seen a dragon. "Flew right over me, it did," she had insisted. "Big as anything. Green, too." Leon had been unable to get a more detailed description from her, and didn't think she had much to offer in the way of truth, although the food hadn't been half bad. He had walked some distance now when he heard voices. He knew bandits were known to inhabit these woods, so he slipped behind a tree and readied himself for attack, when he realized the voices were in fact coming from a clearing not far on, and the source was Gawain and Merlin. He started forward, half relieved, half irritated, when something of their conversation reached his ears, and he stopped, curious. "Look, I said it sometimes takes him a while. But we've been waiting ages. Are you telling me a dragon can't fly faster than this?" "He's close, all right. And," Merlin sighed, "I reiterate, you really shouldn't be here." No way, I'm not missing this. "Gawain, I can't believe you can talk to dragons and you never told me." Leon slid himself behind a tree, his eyes darting around. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Gawain and Merlin were casually discussing dragons. Dragons! Maybe the old woman hadn't been so crazy after all. But what on earth did Merlin and Gawain know about it? Gawain had said Merlin could talk to dragons, but only dragon lords could talk to dragons, and the last one of those was dead. Although he had been part of the final group to fight the dragon, and he knew how ineffectual their blows had been against it, and yet apparently, whilst he and the other knights had been knocked unconscious, and in some cases killed, Arthur had dealt it a mortal blow, although Arthur was somewhat reticent on the details of how he had actually achieved this. And Merlin had been there. All the knights had thought him insane at the time, the servant going into battle with no armor or weaponry, and yet he had survived. He hadn't even been injured. Merlin was sighing now. "I can't believe you haven't gotten over it yet, and technically anyone can talk to dragons." "Not true. Most would be killed first." "True." There was silence for a moment. "Are you waiting for me to realize why I shouldn't be here?" "Is it too much to ask?" "You won't let anything happen to me." And the way Gawain said this, his confidence in Merlin, absolute, took both Merlin and Leon by surprise. "I won't," replied Merlin solemnly. He looked to the sky and said, "Ah, there he is." And there it was indeed. The dragon. The very same dragon that Arthur had supposedly killed. At least, Leon assumed so. He really wasn't sure on how alike they all looked. He could only watch in horror as it landed softly on the ground of the clearing. Gawain had backed away instinctively, and Leon would have done the same had he not known his position would have been revealed. He would have run for the hills if he could. He wasn't a coward, but this seemed foolish in the extreme, verging on suicidal. "You summoned me," the dragon said. The dragon spoke. Seriously. The dragon spoke, quite politely, in fact, although with a sarcastic undertone that indicated irritation. Huh, dragons can be sarcastic. Who knew? Said Merlin. Yes, this is Sir Gawain. I know. Gawain seemed to regain his voice. And how exactly do you know that? And if his voice was slightly higher than usual, who was to judge? Do not fear, I have no interest in harming you. Ah, that's right, the dragon was. Merlin says he can order you about. I did not say that, Merlin hissed. He does occasionally abuse his power, yes. I do not abuse. Really? Said the dragon, cutting him off. I seem to remember you ignoring my advice and saving several people you shouldn't have. He paused. How did that work out for you anyway? Merlin glared at the dragon. The reason I called you here is that someone saw you. And, said Merlin, clearly growing more irritated by the second, in case you've forgotten, you're meant to be dead. It was not my choice to lie, and King Arthur's delusions about killing me are not my responsibility. Would you prefer I just kill you now? Merlin said, his voice sweet, but with a tone that Leon had never heard from him before, threatening with real danger to it. It was this that made it slightly less laughable, this small boy threatening a beast of such tremendous size. The dragon's reaction showed that this was no idle threat, as he drew back slightly. I was only pointing out that you should be more careful with your deceptions. The time for Arthur to know is drawing near. Merlin flinched slightly. Gawain groaned. I don't like the sound of that, he muttered. Like it or not, it is the truth. Any kind of heads up? Tips? That is all you need to know. The rest shall become clear upon discovery. Gawain sighed. He turned to Merlin. Is he always this cryptic? More. The dragon rolled his eyes, but Leon was too numb to even be shocked anymore. Anyway, Merlin said, if you could just keep concealed, that would be really helpful. The dragon sighed. Do I have a choice? None at all. Very well, then. Leon thought vaguely that this was not a very democratic agreement. Thank you. Because Merlin would be polite to a creature he had complete power over. You're welcome. Again, with the sarcasm. Oh, and Merlin? Yes? I hear Arthur is now in possession of the sword Excalibur. Yeah, interrupted Gawain, and he wouldn't let me hold it or anything. The dragon turned his fearsome gaze on Gawain. Well, of course, the sword is not for you to wield. Gawain's eyes widened and he muttered something that sounded like, touchy. Merlin sighed. That's right. And he is currently regent. Yes, Merlin said hesitantly. And Uther's gone mad? I forbid you to attack him, Merlin said immediately, his voice taking on a guttural tone as he sank into the dragon's language. Relax, warlock. I have no intention of harming Uther. There would be no point anyway. His reign is drawing to a close. The point is that it is believed among creatures of magic that there may be a time of need drawing near, and it may be one of Albion's, and incidentally, your defining moments. I assume you can't give me any specific time frame? Soon, Warlock. Soon. Warlock, Leon suddenly thought, registering the term now that it had been used twice. Warlock didn't just mean Dragon Lord. Warlock meant, well, warlock. Magic. Oh, soon, said Gawain. Well, that's alright then. I'll mark it in my calendar. You are beginning to come into your destiny. He looked to Gawain. Both of you. You will have to find these things out for yourself. His gaze was suddenly fixed on the tree Leon was hiding behind. Some people, of course, are more adept at finding things out than we really give them credit for. And with that he smiled. Smiled! At Leon! And then swiftly turned and took off. Merlin and Gawain watched in confusion as the vast creature flew farther and farther away, soon becoming just a spot on the horizon. Leon took a deep breath and stepped forward as Gawain said, What on earth did that mean? Merlin sighed. Sometimes, he said, I think it's better not to ask. They both turned to see Leon at the same time. His shocked expression must have spoken for itself as Gawain moved in front of Merlin and his hand hovered at the hilt of his sword. Leon, he greeted in a friendly tone. Then he paused. How long have you been there exactly? Long enough, Leon replied, his eyes still fixed on Merlin, whose eyes were widened in fear. "Ah," Merlin said. Well, said Leon, his voice calm as he drew his sword to hold at his side. "Now hold up a second," said Gawain. "There is a perfectly reasonable explanation for this." "Really?" said Leon. "A perfectly reasonable explanation as to why Merlin has been lying to everybody? A perfectly reasonable explanation of magic?" "Yes," said Gawain, looking rather pleased that Leon had grasped it so quickly. His smile was cut off by Merlin jabbing him in the back. "Look, Leon," said Merlin, "I know this looks bad. It does. But if you could just hear me out." Leon hesitated before nodding. This was Merlin, after all, and Leon couldn't honestly accept that the boy had an evil bone in his body. Merlin paused, seemingly waiting for something. When Leon didn't move, he cleared his throat and said, "I can talk better when I'm not being threatened with a sword." Leon hesitantly laid it down. "Gawain?" said Merlin. Gawain rolled his eyes, but also laid his sword down. "Right," said Merlin, moving out from behind Gawain, and Leon saw confidence in him, an authority that he'd never truly appreciated before. "Well, as you've evidently surmised, I have magic." "And could talk to dragons," Merlin nodded. "And that. And Arthur didn't kill the dragon." "No, he didn't. But I think it's much better for everyone, particularly Arthur and his ego, if he believes he did." Leon almost could have laughed at that, but he kept his lips firmly pressed together. He had long been puzzled by Merlin and Arthur's relationship and the way Merlin seemed to have utter disregard for rank, but he now wondered if it didn't have something to do with the fact that Merlin could blast people apart if he so wished. "Anyway," Merlin said, "I do have magic, and I understand that you think that makes me evil, but you're wrong." Leon raised his eyebrows. "I am. Yes. See, I use magic for good, mainly for Arthur." "For Arthur?" "Yes, Merlin seemed to weigh his options before taking a step closer to Leon. "See, you know how Arthur's always being mysteriously saved from magical threats?" Leon couldn't say he hadn't noticed. "And you're always around," he said slowly. Merlin gave a slightly pained smile and said weakly, "Ta-da!" "You use magic," said Leon, still getting used to that word being associated with Merlin, "to save Arthur's life." "Mainly." "Why?" Merlin sighed. "You're not exactly the first person to ask me that." "Well then, there are a few reasons, but..." Merlin paused. "Look, I apparently have a destiny to help Arthur." Leon had not been expecting that. "Who did you hear that from?" "Well..." Merlin trailed off, his gaze drifting to the sky. "The dragon?" "Yes." "And..." Leon was struggling to comprehend this. "That's why you learnt magic?" "Oh," Merlin said, sounding a bit surprised. "No, I probably should have explained. I was born with magic." "What?" Leon had never heard of such a thing. "I didn't know that could happen." Merlin smiled slightly sadly. "Not many people do." "And you have kept the secret from Arthur?" "He's not ready," Merlin said simply. "If he finds out now, he may kill you," finished Leon. Merlin closed his eyes and nodded. After a moment, Gawain stepped forward. "Which is why," he said, "we'd really appreciate it if you could keep this quiet." "Why should I?" asked Leon, more out of curiosity as to what they'd say than anything else. "For Arthur," said Merlin. "I know of your loyalty to him and to Camelot, and it's honestly not self-inflation that makes me say that they wouldn't last long without me. So if you won't do it for me..." Merlin's eyes were imploring. "Do it for him?" Leon looked at Merlin's innocent, pleading face, and it didn't escape his attention that Gawain's eyes had drifted to his own sword, lying discarded on the ground. He thought of Arthur, and he wondered if Merlin wasn't underestimating his friend. But then again, what if he wasn't? What if Arthur would have no choice? What if he had to watch Merlin burn? And what if Camelot fell because of it? Leon nodded. "Very well," he said. "I will keep your secret." He looked directly at Merlin. "For both of you." Gawain grinned. "I knew I liked you, Leon." Leon found his horse a little further down the path. Gawain and Merlin had gone to collect theirs from the town where they had left them. Leon's horse had clearly witnessed everything, including a very large dragon, which had understandably spooked her a bit. "Well," said Leon wearily, "you and me both, Thunder. You and me both."